Welcome back. Here we'll be talking about sections 11.4, 11.5, and 11.6. Starting in 11.4, we'll be talking about how skeletal muscle fibers behave. We'll talk about how a nerve fiber stimulates a skeletal muscle fiber. We'll talk about how that stimulation results in the contractile mechanism of the muscle fiber. We'll talk about how specifically muscle contraction and muscle relaxation happen. And we'll talk about how muscle contraction is related to muscle's length. So we have 4 phases of muscle contraction and the following relaxation. So first is excitation, and this is when the nerve action potential is high enough that it leads to the muscle changing physiologically. Then we have the excitation-contraction coupling. This is when that action potential actually does something to the sarcolemma and the myofilaments are activated and thereby they are ready to contract. Then they finally actually do contract and shorten or just develop tension. And finally, once the contraction is over, we return to the resting state by relaxing. This happens when the stimulation ends and the length of the sarcomere returns to normal with the normal decreased tension. So this diagram is showing the thin and thick filaments and how they can slide. So at resting, we have the thin actin filament that is somewhat overlapping with the thick myosin filament. It could also be overcontracted where the thin filaments overlap each other, or we could be overstretched where there's very little contact between the thin and the thick filament. We can talk about rigor mortis as well. So you guys know from maybe some crime documentaries, rigor mortis is when the muscles of the body get very stiff. It happens about 3 to 4 hours after a person dies. Usually, there are some exceptions to this. Okay, so after a person dies, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the endoplasmic reticulum of muscles, it starts to deteriorate, and when it does, it leaks out all of that stored calcium. The stored calcium goes into the cytosol, and that calcium activates the actomyosin contraction, the mechanism of muscle contraction, and it forms cross bridges. But once a person is deceased, they're no longer producing ATP, and ATP is required for muscles to contract, or for muscles to relax. And so with the calcium causing a muscle contraction, but no more ATP to allow for relaxation, we have what we call rigor mortis. It's a muscle contraction that can't be relaxed because of a lack of ATP. Rigor mortis peaks after about 12 hours and then starts to diminish as proteases start to break down the actin and myosin filaments. Moving on to section 11.5. Here we're going to be talking about how a muscle twitches, how a muscle contraction happens. We're going to talk about how a sequence of muscle twitches adds up to a strong muscle contraction. We're going to differentiate between isometric and isotonic contractions, and also differentiate between concentric and eccentric contractions. So a few words that are important for us here. A myogram is a chart that shows the timing and the strength of a given muscle's contracting ability. When I say threshold, what I mean is the minimum electrical voltage that we need to generate the action potential that is going to set a muscle contraction into action. If our voltage is lower than the action potential, the muscles aren't going to do anything. And finally, a twitch is a cycle of contraction and relaxation, and depending on the strength of the stimulus, the twitch may be longer or stronger. We also need to take in consideration a latent period. So after a muscle twitch happens, after a muscle contraction and then relaxation happens, there is a brief delay, essentially when the ions are resetting themselves to normal levels. And that latent period is very short, but during that period, the muscle cannot immediately contract again. The contraction phase is when the muscle is able to generate external tension. The relaxation phase, we've talked about this, is when the muscle returns to its normal resting state. And this is pretty important. Muscle twitches are very fast. They can happen in as short as 7 milliseconds or take as long as 100 milliseconds. Okay, so this latent period, so we have the stimulation, then the latent period, then the contraction, and then relaxation. So we talked about before, if the stimuli does not reach the level of the action potential, we can say it's sub-threshold, and nothing happens. The muscles are not activated by a sub-threshold stimuli if the active action potential is not reached. If the threshold is reached, then we have the twitch produced. There are some things that can impact how strong a twitch is. Okay, so how long the muscle is at the beginning, how tired the muscles are. If the muscles have been warmed up and the enzymes are more ready to work, how much hydration the muscles have, and how frequently this muscle contraction stimulus is delivered to the muscles. So now we're going to look very briefly at the difference between an isometric and an isotonic contraction. Okay, so I think that these pictures are very useful here. So isometric, the muscle tenses, but it doesn't shorten. So if I am talking about the biceps brachii and I have a weight and I'm holding it so my elbow is at greater than a 90-degree angle, and I start to lift that weight, I can feel that muscle tensing. I don't necessarily feel that muscle shorten. My bicep doesn't bulge until I lift the weight higher and the muscle shortens, and then I move into an isotonic contraction. So isometric, we have tension, but the muscle doesn't shorten, and isotonic, the muscle shortens. We can also divide up an isotonic muscle contraction into concentric and eccentric. Okay, so concentric happens as the muscle shortens, so as I'm lifting that weight up to my shoulder, and eccentric happens as the muscle is lengthened, as I'm lowering the weight. So generally speaking, the beginning of all muscle contractions have an isometric phase. The muscle tenses before it starts to shorten. And then the tension levels off and the muscle starts to shorten as the weight is beginning to move. And that's the beginning of the isotonic phase. And we're going to wrap up this video with section 11.6. This is about metabolism in the muscle. We're going to talk about how muscles meet their energy demands. They have very high energy demands, whether they're resting or working. But they meet those energy demands in different ways. We're going to talk about why muscles get tired and why muscles get sore after we use them. We're going to talk about why extra oxygen is needed even after we stop doing exercise. We'll talk about some of the physiological types of muscle fibers and what roles they have in the body. We'll talk about some of the things that impact muscle strength and how both weight training and aerobic endurance exercises change the muscles of the body. So all muscle contraction needs ATP. All muscle contraction requires that chemical energy source. we have two pathways for making ATP. The first is anaerobic fermentation. So this happens in the absence of oxygen or in conditions of very little oxygen, or when the body is operating at an oxygen deficit. Okay, so this anaerobic fermentation, it only produces a small amount of ATP, and it also produces something called lactate or lactic acid. And this lactic acid is later broken down by the liver. So when you have sore muscles, one of the causes of that is lactic acid buildup in the muscles. Aerobic respiration produces a whole lot more ATP than anaerobic respiration. Typically, aerobic respiration doesn't produce a lot of lactate, but in order for this high rate of ATP production to be supported, we need lots and lots of oxygen. So if we have a person who starts off and is running for a little while and then keeps running and then keeps running, let's look at how their ATP synthesis changes in that process. So first, at the very beginning, they are not out of breath. They aren't running yet. So they're just doing aerobic respiration. Okay, they're using the oxygen that is being carried by the myoglobin in the muscles. After a short amount of time, we start to use more ATP than we can produce. So we switch over to what we call the phosphagen system. Then, a little while later, we switch over to the glycogen lactate system. This is anaerobic fermentation. So this is when we start to feel out of breath. Okay, and this will change depending on your level of physical fitness. Some people can run a while before they start to feel out of breath. Some people, it's a much quicker thing to feel out of breath. So once we feel out of breath and we are in a state of low oxygen and our body switches to anaerobic fermentation, the glycogen lactate system is going to be producing those small amounts of ATP. And finally, we can move back into aerobic respiration if we stop running and essentially catch our breath and get out of that oxygen deprivation state. So during short, intense activity, for instance, a 100-meter dash, we have oxygen that comes from the myoglobin. Myoglobin is carrying oxygen, but this gets used up very, very quickly. Okay, so once that's used up, our muscles still need ATP. So it starts using these two enzymes. The two enzymes specifically work with transferring phosphates. So we have myokinase and creatine kinase. Okay, so these two things make up the phosphagen system. So this is kind of the second ATP producing mechanism your body uses after ATP from oxygen from myoglobin is used up. After that phosphagen system is exhausted, also, we have to move into anaerobic metabolism. This produces that lactic acid, while lactic acid is the same as lactate. And this can build up in muscles and cause soreness. It also produces only a very small amount of ATP. And finally, we move into this aerobic respiration. And aerobic respiration is where we are getting sufficient oxygen to produce lots of ATP. This is a switch in how your body is producing ATP. And it takes a little time in order to get into this. Okay, so it takes about 3 or 4 minutes before you're in this aerobic respiration mode. And most people can stay in this anaerobic or this aerobic respiration mode for about 30 minutes. Again, this depends on your level of physical fitness. Some people, distance runners, for instance, can stay in this mode much longer. And after we get past this, if you've ever heard a distance runner say they hit the wall, their body has run out of the ability to do aerobic respiration, and they switch to yet another mode of ATP production where they're burning fatty acids. And this is where fat burning comes in. So if somebody is trying to lose weight, they have to use up all of the ATP sources prior to burning fatty acids, because our bodies don't like to burn fatty acids. We would rather save fatty acids as fat storage. When we use muscles for a long time or use them to do heavy loads of work, we can have muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue happens when the T tubules that are storing the calcium, they get their excitability reduced. It takes more input to release that calcium. We can also have fatigue from long duration, low intensity exercise. If you have done any work with athletes, or if you're going into any sort of sports medicine, VO2 max is an important metric for you to know about. So VO2 max is the ability to maintain very high levels of intense exercise after about 4 or 5 minutes after that creatine phosphase and anaerobic metabolism have turned off, and we're into aerobic metabolism. So this is a measure of the rate of oxygen consumption. Generally, people around age 20 have their highest VO2 max. Males generally have have a higher VO2 max than females. And endurance training, such as distance running, can increase the VO2 max of a person as compared to someone who isn't training. And the last thing that's important here is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. So EPOC is when you finish running and you're standing still, you're not doing any more exercise, but it takes you a couple minutes to catch your breath. Okay, so EPOC is when we are trying to repay the oxygen debt that we created by doing intense exercise. Okay, so it's going to replenish the ATP. It's going to regenerate the creatine phosphatase. It's going to put oxygen back on the myoglobin. It's going to give oxygen to the liver to start breaking down the lactic acid that your muscles generated. And it's going to cause elevated metabolic rates. Okay, so this is another reason why doing fairly intense aerobic exercise can lead to fat loss or reduction in adipose cells, because for some period after exercising, metabolic rates are higher than they were before the person started exercising. So, wrapping up here with some of the differences between muscle fibers. We have what used to be called fast twitch versus slow twitch fibers. So this is talking about how quickly a muscle can get to its peak tension and then relax back to resting state. So big muscles, such as your trapezius and latissimus dorsi in the back, they are kind of quick, and 100 milliseconds sounds very, very quick. But compared to the muscles of your eyes, the larger muscles are significantly slower. So we have what we call slow twitch, slow oxidative, red, type 1 fibers. Okay, so a little bit about the naming here. These names have been reported and used and revised several times. So the naming conventions are a little convoluted here. Okay, so these are all synonyms: slow twitch, slow oxidative, red, type 1. It's a little confusing. Okay, so these are your endurance fibers. These are muscles that we use all day long at low levels. They have lots of mitochondria, they have lots of myoglobin supplying oxygen, they have lots of capillaries for bringing in oxygenated blood, and they tend to be a deep red color. So if you think of a chicken or a turkey, these are going to be like the thigh and the wing meat, the dark meat, okay? They have relatively thin fibers, and they are controlled by small groups of fibers are controlled by one motor neuron. Okay, so we can compare this to fast twitch, fast glycolytic, white, type 2 fibers. And again, these four things are all synonyms, just different naming conventions that have been adapted and revised over, about 70 years of studying muscles. Okay. So here, these are your quick response muscles. This is the muscles you find in your eyes, in your hands, your biceps, things that can move and react very quickly, aren't used generally for stabilizing the body. So these are going to primarily depend on glycolysis and anaerobic fermentation, and their fibers are thick and strong, and typically we have larger groups of muscle cells being controlled by neurons. And then we can talk about this intermediate or fast twitch or type 2A fibers. These are also fast twitch, but they're better at resisting fatigue. Humans don't have very many of these. Some other animal species do. If we look at any muscle in the body, they're going to have a mixture of the different muscle fiber types, but one muscle fiber type will be predominant in that particular muscle. When we talk about how strong muscles are, what we're talking about here is how many cross bridges can form, and the more cross bridges that form, the thicker the muscle is, and the more prominent that muscle looks in the body. So somebody who has been lifting weights is going to be able to form more cross bridges, is going to have thicker muscles that appear larger when you look at the person. The arrangement of the fascicles, remember we talked about parallel fascicles versus pennate versus bipennate. Those arrangements have different relative strengths. How many muscle fibers are controlled by one neuron impacts the strength of the muscle. When we have more than one motor unit being activated at a time, that can impact the strength of the muscle. How frequently the muscle is stimulated, how frequently you use that muscle makes a big difference. The length of the muscle and how tired the muscle is and how often it's used and how vigorously it's used also play a role. So when we do resistance training, when we lift weights, we are using a muscle to lift a load, and that causes resistance to the movement. Doing this a few times a week will cause muscles to be stimulated, and this causes enlargement of the muscle cells. Those myofibrils literally get thicker, and we can see that as muscle development. Kind of conversely, when we have someone doing aerobic exercise, endurance training, distance running, this improves how resistant the muscles are to fatigue. It allows the muscles to produce more mitochondria, which allows for more ATP production. It allows muscles to store more glycogen, so that glycogen is there to provide energy for a longer length of exercise period. It also improves the strength of the skeleton. The bones actually respond to endurance exercise and get stronger. We have increased red blood cells because red blood cells are what carry oxygen to the body. And we have general improvement to the cardiovascular, respiratory, and nervous systems. So this is very, very good for overall physical health.